We may be aware of the Berlin Wall, but do we actually know in depth what it is and its effect on on post-World War II Germany? The Berlin Wall was a huge setback to a devastated nation when they were trying to rebuild themselves. Many of us are unaware of what the Berlin Wall is, as well as we are unaware of its effect on Western Berlin and what its cause was for it to be built. There are 4 main points that will be discussed about the Berlin Wall. To start, I will discuss what led to the Berlin Wall being built, how the Berlin Wall was built, its effect on the citizens of West Berlin, as well as its destruction. Let's start by looking at how it all began. Shortly after World War II, there was tension between Allied nations because they could not figure out how to divide the capital of Germany, Berlin, amongst each other. The Soviet Union had their claim on Eastern Berlin, and the Allied nations, France, Europe, and America, divided up Eastern Berlin amongst themselves. Because of growing tensions, the Soviet Union decided that it was best to put up a blockade. This blockade blocked any connections between Eastern and Western Berlin, and this was considered an international crisis because resources couldn't be transported between the cities. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, this action was made by the Soviet Union because they wanted the Allied nations to release Eastern Berlin into Soviet Union control. They wanted to expand. A response to this blockade by the Allied nations was an airlift, and this continued for about almost a year. They thought that this move, by doing an airlift, would show the Soviet Union that they would not tolerate any type of aggressive expansion across Europe. But Eastern Berlin had more to come. The next response by the Soviet Union-controlled Berlin was to build a wall. Set by the official capital port of Berlin on August 12, 1961, the wall began as a temporary barrier. Connecting roads between the city were torn up, and any building that stood in this way, and this includes homes and businesses, was integrated into the wall. This wall was built by construction workers that lived in Eastern Berlin, but they did this under force by the Soviet Union and were heavily watched by the Soviet Union guards. I would like to show you on the left-hand side, this first picture, this is what the Berlin Wall first began to look like. It just looks like slabs of concrete that were put together. But as years progressed, Soviet Union-controlled Berlin wanted to continue to reinforce this wall, so as time passed, it built up. And then finally, before it was torn down, it looked like a gigantic wall of concrete with designated guard posts to keep eye on whoever may want to pass through Eastern and Western Berlin, if they even could. But even after this wall was built and after a commander died, who was a part of the Soviet Union, its lasting effects were insane. Stalin died in 1953, and this caused Eastern Berlin to think for itself. The government looked at what it had become, and that's when they found out that everything that they had thought they were doing right was completely wrong. Since the wall had been built, year after year, Germans were fleeing to the west when they could. As provided by the art of good government, in 1950, 198,000 Germans fled to the west. The year after, it was 165,000. And efforts to improve life inside the walls of Eastern Berlin, they decided to decrease the price of goods, but they did not decrease the hours that the workers had to put in to create these products. But this was not a good response because these workers, still under harsh conditions of their workplace, decided to not work anymore. And soon an uprising began. As a response, the Soviet Union brought in their tanks to control this uprising. 300,000 Germans fled to the west after this uprising, and then hundreds of people died because of the conflict. But finally, But finally, after 40 years of this wall being up and the Great Suppression to the citizens inside of Eastern Berlin, in November 9th, 1989, the wall finally came down. Said by the U.S. Diplomacy Center, the President Ronald Reagan wrote an exhortation to the current leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, that he needed to tear the wall down. The night of, the policemen of Eastern Berlin walked away from their posts and went home. And the people's safety was secured by pre-existing diplomacies. So that night, they chipped at the wall until it was completely broken down and they were able to reconnect with those on the western side of Berlin. Overall, looking at this, we can tell that the Berlin Wall was a great obstacle in Germany trying to rebuild itself after World War II. What we looked at was what led to the Berlin Wall being built, how the Berlin Wall was built, its effect on the citizens inside of Western Berlin, and then its destruction that finally reunited those that had been separated for over 40 years to each other. This is definitely a learning experience for any nation that has to rebuild itself after a world war. We can take from this that the Western Berlin or any type of force to expand or to control citizens does not help a nation rebuild itself from any type of conflict. The Berlin Wall was definitely a reminder to Germany, even after the war, that there are different ways to secure people.